Hello, my name is Boris Giltburg, I'm a pianist, and this is a tutorial on Rachmaninow's Étude-Tableau Opus 39 number 6 in A minor. All of Rachmaninow's Étude-Tableaus combine a strong narrative and a strong technical element into a seamless whole. But for me, the story of this one etude is perhaps the most interesting of them all. I'll play a few bits. We have the growl of the wolf. And then we have the fleeting Red Riding Hood trying to escape. And this is really easy to see immediately in the beginning. And then we have this curious thing already, something is unusual, is that the end is the wolf. So I think, okay, so Rachmaninoff rewrote slightly the story. In his imagination, the wolf wins in the end. He eats Red Riding Hood. But that's not the end of it. In the middle section, there begins a kind of hunt. So something is hunting something else. And we would say, okay, it's the wolf hunting Red Riding Hood. But listen to what happens. Here's the section. And it gets faster and faster and louder to a kind of demonic hunt. But the music which is represented here in the bottom of the keyboard is the melody of the Red Riding Hood itself. So he takes this melody, transposes into the bottom of the keyboard, makes three of them, as if there were three wolves, as it were, and then the hunt begins. But the material is from Red Riding Hood itself. So it is almost as if in Rachmaninoff's imagination, the wolves that are hunting Red Riding Hood are kind of twisted doppelgangers of Red Riding Hood herself. What it all means, I cannot tell you, but I find it fascinating to have this kind of prism of Rachmaninoff's imagination, channeling the story which we all know of Red Riding Hood and the wolf into something much more multi-layered, complex, and eventually interesting. We can all make of it what we want, but I think no one can deny the very strong psychological power of this dark story and of this dark music. Now about the technical side of things. The key thing which we need in this etude is fingers. Everything comes from very active finger work, both the wolf and Red Riding Hood itself. So what do the fingers do? I imagine the fingers as divided into separate joints, and each joint being independent of the others. So you do not play with the finger as a whole unit which you push into the key through the hand like this, but rather I can almost imagine little teeth at the end of your finger at the point of contact between the finger and the key, and there's a bit of a biting or pinching motion happening when you press each key. It's very easy to practice in staccato because then you can actually make this sharp pinching motion. So you see, the wrist doesn't do anything at all. It's relaxed and steady, static. It's only the fingers that do all the work. So it's a biting motion for every single note. And no matter how boring it is, this is really the way we need to work on every single passage in semiquavers in this piece. Because what we want in performance is utmost clarity. We want each one of these, which I think most of us would play with 3-2. We want them to really bite and sparkle and run away, but to be always audible. So we want every single note. So this kind of work we need to do in preparation. It's usually best done slowly. So in a tempo in which you have control over every single muscle of your hand. And you can also do it in the left hand as well. And of course here. So this motion of the fingers also works in legato. We basically do the same thing, but without lifting the arm between the notes. But the finger is as active as if I will be playing. So you can practice like this. If you're not used to this kind of very active fingers, you might find that it takes a while to build up the muscles. We don't think of it, but we have little muscles here under every joint, and like with going to the gym, you need a bit of time to build them up if you were not using them before. One important thing to say, when you're doing this kind of work, pay a lot of attention to your forearm, because there's a danger of tensing here, the forearm and the elbow joint, and if this goes on for too long a time, then this can create damage to your muscles, to your arm. So when you're doing this very active finger work, pay always attention to the fact that the wrist and the forearm are always relaxed. So here's a tense one. This is bad, and as soon as you relax it, the fingers can just continue their work. So this one thing is the basis of almost the entire etude, and there's no need to mention it again. As soon as you see semiquavers or triplets, know that you need these fingers to be very active. Note in bar 3 that there is an unusual diminuendo. So the first thing is clear, it's a growl, so it starts quietly and then explodes. So you can also start a bit slower and do a little accelerando. You really want the effect of something coming towards you suddenly from the darkness. But then on the first bit of the third bar, he wrote a diminuendo. But this diminuendo is just for the beginning of the bar, so it creates this kind of effect. It's like something slightly jumps at you, then retreats, and then goes full power. So this can be, again, done very theatrically. There's a lot of theatricality in the piece in general, and we can also play with timing between the bars. So we have wait, and the last one is piano. While you're waiting, don't move. It's visually also important to create this feeling of tension, of waiting, of apprehension. Because imagine we start doing this, and it's ruined completely. This, whatever we built in the first bar, disappears. So just keep steady. And the last snap of the teeth. In the material of the Red Riding Hood, he put little dots on the first note of each group. So we could think this is staccato, which is what it would normally mean, but because he already wrote Ruggiero, I treat them as a kind of marker for saying this is a melodic note. And because we know later that this will become melodic, and so on, I would play them ever so slightly longer than this. But instead, so I'm almost slurring the first, not quite, but almost. This is a neat trick that if something is longer, we perceive it as being louder. It's like a little spotlight that you shine on that voice. So instead of, we have. And this is our phrase. Note the long note in bar 9 and the same thing in bar 15. You could take pedal here, but this creates a cloud which I personally don't like. So what I do, I use the middle pedal. Just for one bar. It's the eternal question of, did Rachmaninow have access to the middle pedal? To be honest, I do not know, but even if he didn't and if he had something else in mind, I think the texture as presented in the score is not against the idea of this being like a note in the horns, which doesn't affect the rest of the texture at all. So this remains, because if we were to use the right pedal, the very dramatic change of texture, I think, would detract from the power of the music. Then the material continues more or less the same. We have little snaps of teeth in bar 22 and 24, which we can do very actively again. So this can be very aggressive and sharp. And here, for example, he does put a little slur, so we can use pedal in the end of bar 21. This is the first time there are actual slurs on these groups. And then the explosion again. So this is longer. And again. And again in bar 25, I would use the middle pedal here. Here we have 3 of these notes to make sure that this is still separated. Again, he marks these notes, so I would play them a bit longer. And you can use pedal on these slurs. And now a complete change of texture and sound. It's all soft, rounded, and you can use a lot of pedal. Inside this pedaled world, still use a lot of fingers to make sure we still have the clarity inside. But here, color and atmosphere are key. And the end, this would be bar 34, you can once again finish dry and biting. So don't be afraid of this slightly extroverted theatricality. This piece really thrives on it. This brings us to the middle section with the aforementioned hand. So we have several voices, several wolves, doppelgangers, no matter coming in. It's really cool to show all the entrances. So we have the first one. And then it continues. So don't pay so much attention to the thumb of the left hand, but always stay in the middle voice. And then the 2 voices coming in the right hand. So we have, but also the middle one. There's like three versions. Every time you have this passage, make sure to make it as biting as you can in a crescendo. This is the snaps of teeth. And pay attention to the articulation where he writes it. We have the tenuto marks, staccato, and again staccato, tenuto. And sometimes they do not correspond between the upper voice and the lower voice, and doing them exactly as he writes helps ensure the separation of voices. Now, it starts in pianissimo, and then we have the next dynamic, piano, in 46. There are 2 options. We get from pianissimo to piano in these bars. The other option is that we get something bigger than piano, and then we drop down to piano. I would advocate the second approach, because I find that these little crescendos and also the build-up of the voices creates a kind of growth which naturally would lead us to a larger sound. So you could go with an actual crescendo, and even more at the end of bar 43, and here drop. Again, this almost playing with their prey. They're going at her and then receding at the last moment. Now the 2 voices, the upper voice of the right hand, but also once again, you will see that he marks these little staccato dots, which I think here don't mean staccato, but mean this is a melodic note and should be played as such. So play them a little bit longer. Also, everything until here in the middle section was slightly slower than our main tempo, poco meno mosso, and here we start also an accelerando. So levels and levels of build-up, dynamic accumulation of voices and build-up of tempo. Throughout all of this, the fingers as biting as we had them in the semis, so everything is very sharp. If you want, you can make, like we did in the beginning, the third note of this motive a bit longer. So instead of do, it helps ensure continuity in the ear because we are very acutely aware of long versus short. And when we hear this short, short, long, short, short, long, we think, we heard this already. This is the same motive that we had in the beginning. Then we get to bar 49 after a series of these snaps. And then he writes a long note in the tenor, this E flat. I would once again hold it with the middle pedal to make sure that everything else can stay staccato. And now things become heavier and a bit louder. With mezzo forte, and we have octaves. Then we have a kind of climax here, but then it recedes right away. So levels of build-up and then go back to piano. This can be done very effectively. Especially in the diminuendo, use as many finger as you can, as many active fingers as you can. And pay extra attention to the upper voice, playing it a bit longer than the rest to make sure that it does not get swallowed in the diminuendo. Now, from here, bar 53, things become faster and more difficult. We have jumps in the left hand. It's almost like we have two characters in the left hand alone, and we need to make sure that everything is clean. So the key is to jump and land on the key before we play. So here, we move with the hand, we make sure we are on the key, we play, and the same thing going upwards. Avoid playing at the moment of landing, because then there's a danger. If you misjudge the distance, you might land on the wrong key and there's no time to correct. If you jump as soon as you can, then you have a little microsecond to adjust the position of the hand. Don't pay any attention to the right hand by practicing it alone before and making sure that the fingers just know where to go, staying very close to the keyboard, basically navigating their way by touch. I like holding the upper voice here more. It's not exactly as you wrote it, but I find that this slightly brought out upper voice, contrasting with the very biting lower voices, and everything snappy and biting in the left hand gives our ears something to latch onto. Otherwise, it's all just sharp and short and we don't know what to listen to. This keeps the melody still in our ears. So the right hand is navigating by touch. And visually, we're concentrating on the left hand. Another little trick is that if you look at the note you want to jump to, just before you jump, it helps or improves the chances of getting to the right note, which is why our attention stays here with the left hand. And the right hand is just left to its own devices. When you have these black key, white key, black key, white key, I find it a very strange fingering of playing the black note octave with 1 and then 4 and 3 glued together like this. And then the white one with 1, 5. Again, black note 1 and 4 and 3 glued together. What it does, as you see, the wrist doesn't need to move at all. It just stays in the same position. You naturally, as you extend the hand, the fifth is shorter, so it doesn't land on the key unless you turn the wrist. You end up automatically with either 4 or 3, depending on your hand, on the note that you want to play. I land on them both, which is why I'm playing with them both. And it also gives a little bit more strength and bite. And thus we get to the presto, which is the climax of the hunt. It is the climax of excitement, of danger, and also of danger for us because it is a very tricky and difficult section. So definitely work on the hands separately and slowly. The left hand is a little bit the same thing we discussed. It's all jumps. So you have a lot of time to jump between the chords. One way to practice is to repeat each chord twice. Do it in a very steady, constant rhythm with the same weight given to both notes. Use always the time between the chords to jump. What it ensures is that when you then switch to playing it as should be, you will discover that all of a sudden you have so much time because you got used to the steadiness and to having an extra chord in between. And all of a sudden when you remove these extra chords like teeth of a comb, then all of a sudden you have this empty space which you can use psychologically to maneuver your hand around the keyboard. Everything is very close to the keyboard, apart from one important point. You don't want to move your hand flat on the keyboard, because the way the elbow joint is functioning, going flat creates tension here just above the elbow joint, and you want to avoid it. So what we do instead is a very low arch, almost so low that you don't notice it, but it's a big difference between this, which immediately blocks your movement, and slightly lifting it up just a couple of centimeters above the keyboard, which then releases this tension. So I'll do it very slowly. Goes a little bit up, rather than going completely flat on the keyboard. But never so high up that you waste time or energy between the jumps. And the last element of this left hand is bite to the fingers. Once you did land on the right notes, bite. So this very active taking of the sound, the same thing we discussed throughout the etude. The right hand, once again, we'll have to navigate by touch because the eyes will probably be glued to the left hand with the jumps, which will become larger and larger as we progress in the climax. So the right hand is sort of crawling up. And you can use the time between each group to move to the next one and maneuver your hand to the right notes. Now, for extra emphasis, this last one with the accent can be with more weight and even more bite. This one. So a proper accent and a bit of pedal, I would say, on the last one. So the rest I'm playing dry, without pedal. And here. And do practice slowly. Don't be tempted to rush into a fast tempo because you can sort of play it. You want to create muscle memory and control, and this is only achievable in a slow tempo. So the rule of thumb is don't play in a faster tempo than the tempo in which you at this moment can control all the elements that you want to control. And if it's a very slow tempo at first, don't despair. You will build up tempo in a healthy way within a few days/weeks. But then when you get to the fast tempo, it will be controlled, steady, and it will not feel fast to you. It will sound very fast. Whereas if we go directly to a very fast tempo in a complex texture like this, there is such a risk that we lose control. It becomes messy, and then we also don't know what to do. We don't know how to save the situation because we just don't have this muscle memory, the precise movements. It's a little bit like training your body, your hands to be in the right place, in the right rhythm, in the right dynamic, with the right touch. So all the elements in place correctly, and then in tempo on stage you can let go and it will just work. The little transition in bar 63, it's distinct groups in the left hand, then you move, then you move, so treat it as chords that are just broken, and then even more sound here, then going back to the piano. Here the sforzando can be really powerful as an extra contrast to the piano. Maybe even lean forward. Using a bit more your shoulders, your upper forearm. Then the same grouping again. And finally, the climax proper. So the left hand is all the same. Positioning of the hand between the jumps and bite upon arriving in the right keys. Finger work and concentrating on the left hand and letting the right hand deal with itself. And here I would use pedal on pairing the... It creates a slightly hooligan-y sound, this oompa-oompa, which I find fits with the music very well. Then this also, a lot of bite on each one. Don't let any of them be swallowed. And then you grind to a halt. In an almost exaggerated theatrical way, because there will be another explosion now and we want to create this false sense of stillness before we jump into the next bit. So this is a juxtaposition of two elements. We have these growls and we have longer horn-like notes. And it's nice to be able to hear the long notes throughout the texture. These are quite strong. Then from here on, the left hand can be very short and biting, but not very loud. As we can still hear the horns. And the change of color here. So this, it says piano. Take this dynamic as to be whatever point you got to in the diminuendo, in the natural decay of the sound. So if you have... It starts to decay. And then you take the same sound and you play the next note in the sound to which you arrived in the natural decay of the octave before. And then we have groupings here. Group 1. Group 2, Group 3, Group 4, and now shorter groupings. And you can choose for yourself. For example, one option could be the first, third, and fifth group are heavier, the second, fourth, and sixth are lighter, like this. Or the other way around. Whichever you want, but it's nice to separate these two sets of groups just to explain to the audience that we have 1, 2, and so on. Then when it gets quicker, don't forget the jumps between the octaves. Here the right hand will bother you. So keep the right hand as flat to the keyboard, as close to the keyboard as you can, to leave as much maneuvering space for the left hand as you can. Here it's better sotto, under, over, over, under, and over. And now we tumble down. The right hand is not so difficult. You still need finger bite, but you have big gaps between the groups so you can move the hand. It's the left hand which usually gets messy if one is not careful. So same thing we discussed several times here, positioning, moving the hands between the notes, practicing maybe, and so on. And then when you finally get to the last ones, you can really lean on the keyboard. This is the crash. Then it's usually in a concert hall advisable to take a little bit of time between the end of this crash and the next bit, which is the reprise. Because if we start immediately, it gets swallowed, and in a concert hall much more than here. So I would treat it as a mini fermata here. And then from the sort of dissipating cloud of dust, if you think cinematically, we once again see the outline of Red Riding Hood fleeing. So the material in the reprise is exactly the same. You might want to change color by using una corda, or you might not want, it's completely up to you. But then we have a little coda, as it were. So we get to bar 101, and now we have something new. This is slightly more plaintive, slightly more personal. Then again, sharpness and biting. Once again, this kind of pleading. So this contrast. Work on the left hand alone. A lot of fingers and bite in the right hand, but it is the left hand which is leading. But it's very nice to create this mini separation between the bars of sharpness and the softness and more personal music, even though he doesn't really mark anything. But if we were to play it exactly the same, we lose the inherent theatricality and drama which can be created by separating them into two different characters. And then the final bit of melody. It's really like in a fairy tale, the afterword of what happened after the story has ended. And here it's slightly sad and grim at the moment. Note how there's a syncopation in the left hand. And you can also treat these in bars 107 as another voice. All of this quite subtle, so you don't need to show it by making it louder or longer or anything, but just separate as much as you can. The more you put them together, the more flat it becomes and less interesting. The more you treat every element of all the voices as a separate character, a separate motive, the more interesting and 3D things are. And then, like something distant, and thus our tale does not end. So when we think, once again, lured into a false sense of security, things jump at us once again. You can take quite a bit of time on these first notes. Then, like in the beginning, there is a diminuendo and the final roar and another. So you can really play with timing and maintain a lack of movement, so don't move between the bars like we did in the beginning. And here's an interesting thing. In the beginning, bar 5, this last chord is piano. Here it's not marked, so it can be a louder snap. So we have the last 3 bars. and almost recoil from the piano. And I promise to you that there will be a kind of uneasy laughter going in the audience, because it's such an entrancing, captivating piece of musical theater in those 2 minutes 40 seconds that it really deserves for every ounce of potential musical and dramatic narrative to be extracted from it and presented to the audience. This is the end of this Henle music tutorial. Thank you very much for watching.